Oh, there it goes. It worked. Well, welcome back, everyone. This is Two Beards and a Bible. I'm John Swano.
I'm Dave Tenney.
And we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And
we think we left off at verse
5.
Yeah. But if we are covering this again, we apologize.
Let's consider it a bonus.
Yes.
Hopefully we say the same thing.
Otherwise, yeah. I hope so. I guess I'll read. I'm going to read quite a bit here. I'm going to read to verse 17. It says, so I guess maybe we should talk about, before we get started here. So, in the few verses, Paul's basically having some trouble with the Corinthians who are following after either Apollos or after either Apollos or Paul, whoever taught them. You know, they've become devotees of that person rather than of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what Paul is, and he's in the first 5 verses he talked about that. So
and he's speaking to the church as a whole.
The church as a whole. In verse 4, he said, "For when one says, 'I am of Paul,' and another, 'I am of Apollos,' are you not carnal or not worldly minded?"
Mm-hmm.
So then he continues on here in verse 5. He says, "Who then is Paul, and who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one? I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, and each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers, and you are God's field. You are God's building, according to the grace of God which was given to me as a wise master builder. I have laid the foundation, and another builds on it. But let each one take heed how he builds on it, for no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. If anyone's work which he has built on it endures, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss. But he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, which temple you are."
All right.
All right. Lots of interesting things in there.
Yeah, to start off, this idea of asking that question, who then is Paul and who is Apollos? When we look down at verse 7, we realize that it's God that gives the increase. And for us today, I think sometimes we put a lot of trust in human beings, and when and perhaps we think as Christians that, well, I can't. Who am I to minister to this person? Who am I to teach them of the scriptures? I need a preacher to do that. Yeah. As if we're any different than anybody else. Just it's good for us all to remember that it's God that brings forth the increase. It's not you. It's not your the things that maybe you feel like you don't have a gift in. If you don't have a gift in public speaking or whatever, well, God can use that. It's the word of God that is powerful. It's not a person.
I think, and also Paul talks, he tells them there in verse 4, which we read at the beginning, there's a group of people that were saying, "Hey, I'm of Paul," or "I'm of Apollos." Well, Paul's making the point is, no, you can't be of us. You got to be of Christ.
Right.
You're not disciples of Paul or disciples of Apollos. You're disciples of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they had missed that.
Yeah.
And that's why he says, who then is Paul? Well, what did Paul do? Paul didn't do anything.
Right.
Not for the saving of mankind.
Right. Yeah. All he did is speak the truth.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Apollos didn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
He continued on that work that Paul started.
And I think that even today, perhaps we see some symptoms of this kind of thinking in the religious world, where I've heard people say, when I've spoken to them about the scriptures, I've heard them say, well, Father so and so, speaking of a priest,
Yeah.
Says this, or preacher so and so says this. Very infrequently do you find people speaking from their own knowledge of the scriptures.
Oh, yeah. And it goes back to I think when that sort of thinking is how churches get creeds,
Mm-hmm.
right? Rather than deferring to the Bible, they decide to state their beliefs in a separate document.
Yeah.
And the problem is now we end up doing just what the Jews did. Now this creed becomes what we're holding to, not the Word of God.
Yeah.
And what happens when something is in that creed that maybe not quite in line with God's Word?
It causes damage.
It does.
And it causes generational damage.
Yeah.
I think probably everybody listening to this can attest to, whatever religious group that you were affiliated with, growing up as a child or even now. Why is it that you're affiliated with that group? It's probably because mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, great grandma were a part of that group.
Yeah, I haven't read it in a while, but I remember reading the Creed of the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
And that word Catholic, I believe, means universal. That's the idea of what Catholic means. It means a universal church. And if you kind of put that word in mind and you read their creed, well, I can't help but not agree with about 90% of it.
Right.
I mean, it's mostly right. Their creed. Now they added a lot to that, but their basic creed and a lot of denominational churches, you'll see that there's a lot of, but it's the things that aren't right are the problem.
Yeah, almost is not enough.
Right.
Yeah, and that's when we look at this again, where it says that if you build on another, foundation, that is, what verse was that? Verse 10.
Yeah.
According to the grace of God which was given to me, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another builds on it. But let each one take heed how he builds. For no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it. When you think of, I can't help but go to, Catholic pops up right away when I think of gold, silver, precious stones, and so on.
Because of the beautiful buildings that they have.
Having been to the Vatican and seen all that stuff. But then there are other groups as well, that have very similar situations going on. And that really is, think of what happened when Notre Dame burned a few years ago. People, it's a beautiful building.
Yeah.
But people really, really, hung on to that building as if it were something sacred and special.
Yeah.
And to many people it is. But again, it's basically, it's wood, hay, straw, and gold, and silver. It's just stuff that burns up.
And the problem is what Paul isn't talking about physical things, right?
No, that's true. Yeah.
He's talking about spiritual things. There's lots of Bible verses that have this idea of a building. I wrote a couple of them down here. In 1 Peter 2:5, Peter says that we're built up as living stones. So that's kind of this idea of, we're all a stone in the foundation of the church.
Mm-hmm.
We're a spiritual foundation. Think about Jesus, and when Peter made the confession, that Jesus was the Christ in Matthew chapter 16.
Right.
And what did Jesus tell him upon this?
Thou art Peter, on this rock I will build my church.
Yeah. And the rock wasn't Peter,
right?
But it was the confession that he made that Jesus was the Christ.
Right.
So that spiritual house has got to be built on that foundation.
Right.
And how many times does it say that that Jesus was the cornerstone, or the chief cornerstone that the builders rejected, the Jews rejected? I mean, there's like 5 or 6 verses that reference that idea.
Yeah, so, and that's a good point. And we tend to think it's hard for us to get out of our physical existence.
Yeah.
And therefore, people look religiously for physical things.
Yeah.
They get wrapped up in buildings and in artwork and things that men consider sacred.
Paul indicates here that he laid the foundation for this church. Well, listen, he didn't do it with a shovel.
Right.
That's not how he laid the foundation.
Right.
And then he talked about how another build on it. And I think what he's talking about in this context, he's talking about Apollos.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul came to Corinth, and he stayed there a couple of years, and he started this congregation, and he taught them. And then Apollos, after Paul left, Apollos came in and continued working on that same thing.
Yeah. When you think of it, just, and I'm sure this is why it's written, because people have knowledge of building things.
Yeah.
And when you build a wall, when you build a building, that first course that you lay down has to be straight and square. And if it is, then the rest of them will just fall right into place.
Right. But if you start off crooked,
then the rest, or if you do something goofy halfway up, and mess up the pattern that you have going,
the building's going to come apart.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. And he kind of alludes to this point that whatever you're going to build on, it better be built on Jesus. He says that which is Jesus Christ. He says if anybody builds on this foundation, he says all these different materials. He says for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work. If anyone's work which he has built on it endures, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. Okay, there's some complicated stuff in there.
Mm-hmm.
So this first idea, he talks about a person's work, and he's talking about the day that'll declare it.
Right.
And
it's interesting that that's capitalized, the day.
The day. So what do you think that's alluding to?
I think it's alluding to the day of judgment.
Probably, yes. Because it is capitalized.
Yeah, it is specifically a day, that is, it's capitalized for a reason.
Yeah.
With the translators.
I'm curious what...
Zur doesn't really speak to it. I looked
that up. I don't know if I'm going to look here in the Greek if that word is translated as some other thing. So let's see. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And what's the verse?
13.
13. The day. I don't know. It's a period.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It says meaning that is gentle day, tame, that is gentle day, that is literally the time space between dawn and dark, or the whole 24 hours, but several days were usually reckoned by the Jews as inclusive of the parts of both extremes. Figuratively, a period, always defined more or less clearly by the context. Age, away, day, judgment, time, while, years. So I guess it could be. But
in the way that you have to ferret that out too, is that general definition. If you really start digging into like the Thayers,
Yeah.
then you have to go to the specific instance of that usage to find out exactly what it
Yeah.
was meaning. But there at the end, it did mention judgment.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I'm leading.
The other thing too is, that's probably the right, because it talks about fire,
Mm-hmm.
and it, and we know, that the end of the world is going to be, the world's going to be destroyed by fire. The Bible says that, so
Right.
probably kind of alludes to that. I guess another way you might look at it is whenever conflict comes,
Right.
your building can fall apart.
Right.
Yeah,
and and what is it that will be judged on the day of judgment?
right.
It'll be those actions. It'll be how we handled ourselves during those times.
I mean, certainly in this context, what's Paul talking about? He's talking about the church at Corinth.
Right.
And I think that's why he says there, he says, if anyone's work which he has built on it endures, he will receive a reward. I think that Paul, in some ways, might be talking about himself. He says, if anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. What I think this is me trying to figure this out. Paul established this church. He put all this work into it. If that church falls away, I mean, Paul's going to suffer. He's going to be upset about that,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not going to affect his salvation.
Right.
Whether they do the right thing or not, it's not going to affect him.
And I think that lines up with the fact that this letter was written to a group. It was written to the church at Corinth, and that would make sense.
Yeah.
And it would. You could be confused by it if you read it perhaps out of context and take it to be towards an individual or to myself.
Yeah.
Because then how would, if our work didn't stand, then how could we still be saved? Right. But in speaking to the church, if anyone's work fails,
right,
then the church still there. It was not, the church isn't dependent on one person's actions.
Yeah. And all of this is, he's talking generally. So correct. Even this next part, in verse 16, he says, do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. So one thing that's interesting, this is a thing that I learned from Matt DeVore, who's a preacher at another church here locally, that in the King James Version, that it uses, anytime it uses a Y word, ye, you, it's plural. And anytime it uses a TH word, it's singular. So, I guess when we look at that verse, what is it? It's in chapter 3 and
16?
verse, is it 16? Yeah. If we look at the King James Version, it says, know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you. And we know by those Y words that he's talking plurally.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about the church.
Right.
He's not talking about Apollos.
Right.
Or Bill, whoever. Bill Smith that's sitting in the third row.
Right. Yeah, and that lines up perfectly with who he's speaking to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he says that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you. Yeah, it's interesting. You think about, go all the way back to Adam. When Adam and Eve were on the earth, God dwelt with them. But then what happened?
They went against his word.
Yeah. So then God couldn't have anything to do with them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because he can't have anything to do with sin. So God had to turn his face from them. Then you head into the Mosaic dispensation, and and they had a temple. God dwelt in the temple, but you couldn't have anything to do with sin there either. It had to be a consecrated place.
Right.
And bring that to us in the Christian time. He says that basically that we're like the temple. Each of us. So later on, I believe he says that. Where is that?
Verse 17, it speaks of defiling the temple.
Yeah. I think it's later on here, but he says you are the temple. It's here in this.
In verse 16.
Verse 16.
Do you not know that you are the temple of God?
You are the temple.
Yeah.
So now Christians are the temple, right? So I guess what I'm getting at.
I still see that as being to the church.
Yes, absolutely.
That the church.
Yeah, plural.
Correct, right.
Yeah, the church is the temple.
Yeah.
Right? So with all that in context, he says that you are the temple of God and the Spirit of God dwells in you. So, the Spirit of God dwells within the church.
Right. And I think that there's something that comes to my mind. How does the Spirit dwell today? It dwells in the Word. Yeah. And so if we are to be called His church, we have to be in the Word. Yeah. The Word has to be in us. We can't claim Christ and yet go against what His words say. So it's not speaking to religious groups that aren't keeping the Word.
Right. I mean, the Spirit of God dwells within us as a group when we're doing His will.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's how the Spirit of God dwells with us. And when we're not doing His will, guess what?
Right.
The Spirit of God doesn't dwell with us.
It lines up with, many will come to me and say in that day, have I not?
Yes.
Done all these things in your name.
Absolutely. He says, if anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. Plural again. So if anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, to me, that references those that fall away.
Mm-hmm. Or those that bring
false things
in amongst the brethren.
Yes.
Yeah.
But both of those things.
Or as we live our lives, if we're living a double life, and we're bringing sin into the church.
And I think in context that's probably the correct view. I mean, it's probably the correct way to look at that.
Yeah.
All right, what are we doing on time? Okay, maybe we can get to into. So you want to read 18 through 23?
Sure. So verse 18 beginning, let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, for it is written, He catches the wise in their own craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. Therefore, let no one boast in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, or the world or the life or death, or things present or things to come, all are yours. And you are Christ's, and Christ is God's.
Interesting stuff there.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing is that he says, let no one deceive himself. And let me see here if let me get a different translation. The King James, me and the King James, we just don't always get along real well. So in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7, I think there's some good commentary about being deceived. So Paul here in Corinthians says, let no one deceive himself. And in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7, it says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh, from the flesh will reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. So I think that the idea is here is, when we're talking about deceiving ourselves, what are we doing to ourselves?
Setting ourselves up for failure. I mean, we think that we're so smart that we can pull one over on God, perhaps.
Yeah.
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 Go ahead.
I mean, I think that's what we do.
I have a side story.
Yes.
I told it the other day. Maybe I've told you before, but when I had the driving school one night in our office in Coventry, the girl went back into the bathroom, and before long, smoke was billowing out from under the door.
Was she building a fire in there?
Something like that. and so I just stopped class, and I went back there and stood in the office staring at the door. And she opened up the door. She was spraying perfume and stuff all over the place to try to cover the smell. And I'm like, do you think I'm stupid? Like, I wasn't born yesterday. What are you doing? How did you think you were going to get away with this? And in her mind, she was being smart because she went to the back room and she had the stuff to cover the smell, but you can't cover that smell. And sometimes I think we are like that with God. That we think, well, I can cover this up. Nobody knows that I'm doing this, and we get ourselves into, God's going to stand there on the day of judgment and say, "What are you doing?
Yeah.
How could you think?"
I remember in high school, there was a cosmetology class, and of course, this is back in like 1990. All the girls smoked in there, and they always used and that was the days of hairspray.
Yeah.
I always wondered how there wasn't a big explosion in the girls' bathroom because they'd all be smoking and spraying hairspray, and that explodes. It burns.
Back in my teenage days, I still have a mischievous streak in me, I suppose. I like to pull practical jokes, and so my friend's mother smoked, and so I used to take her lighters and turn them up so that when she would lit her cigarettes, the flame would be like a foot tall. Well, she also used a lot of hairspray and had the wall of bangs.
Oh, yes.
And she caught her hair on fire one day. And from then on, every lighter in the house was hidden when I came over.
Oh, that is awesome. Oh, boy. So we talk about becoming. It says, if any among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool that he may become wise. So one of the Proverbs 3 and verse 5, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. So
yeah. And I think there's a thread to that, or something that can be applied in so many places in our spiritual lives. As we read through the scriptures and we come to the understanding that, like for baptism, for instance, is something that is commanded of all men. We don't need to understand why.
right.
We know what it's for.
Yeah.
And but try to understand the mechanics of, well, why would God want us to go down into some water? What sense does that make? It doesn't have to make sense in your head.
I never understood why so many denominational people don't believe that baptism is required for salvation when it's taught so plainly over and over and over.
Yeah.
But and a lot of them are very scholarly people. They will go to extreme lengths to try to disprove the simple and plain teaching of the Bible.
Yeah.
I mean, even Jesus said, he who believes and is baptized will be saved. Okay, okay, that sounds pretty simple, right?
Speaking of God, saying that my commands are not burdensome.
Yeah.
This is not burdensome.
No.
Now, what's the big deal?
It's not even hard.
Right.
I don't know. I do not understand what the problem is.
The importance is that you understand why you're doing it. That you're, that you're submitting to the authority of Christ and being buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins. And that's, that's it.
Yeah, Romans 6.
It's very simple.
Romans chapter 6.
Right.
That's what baptism does.
Yeah.
Acts chapter 2. That's what it's for.
Right.
I mean, it's not really that tough, and Jesus commanded it. But that's I think that's an example of some people have they stand on their own they try to refute these basic teachings so they look like they're super smart.
Right.
And they lead a lot of people to hell.
Right. And there's just we just don't need to know everything. That's the essence of faith. Do you think of Thomas? What was Thomas told?
Yeah.
Blessed are those that don't have a sign.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
faith means that you're willing to do it, even though it doesn't make common sense to you.
And it's funny. It says in verse 19 here. It says, "For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God."
Yeah.
So the thing that we got to understand is God, the Creator, He looks at the wisdom of the world and He says, "That's a bunch of fools."
Yeah. He catches the wise in their own craftiness.
And the opposite is also true.
Mm-hmm.
The wisdom of God is foolishness to the world, though.
Right.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
The Bible actually indicates that as well.
And I think it's interesting that as time goes on and, thinking scientifically among those that are well educated and they try to figure out the inner workings of this universe and of this world, as time goes on, God really does catch them in their own craftiness.
Yes.
When they make up these theories, they eventually find out that, well, that's not the way that it works.
Yeah.
I just saw something recently about, maybe I mentioned this last week, that there was a scientist that, figured something out about the expansion of the universe and that it isn't working the way that they always thought that it was.
And I think I've said this before, but if you ever gave evolution a real look, hard scientific look, doesn't hold up very well.
Right.
Back in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 21, which we already read, though, there's a commentary that says, since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe.
Yeah.
And he kind of indicates the opposite here. The wisdom of the world is foolishness with God.
Right.
So the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, and they are futile.
And human beings have had everything that they need to know about God, in the beginning.
Yeah.
And throughout the time of in the wilderness, they had everything they needed to know, but yet they still continued to fall away.
Absolutely. So he says, therefore, let no one boast in men. And I think it goes back. That's why he says here, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So these Corinthians had been following after Paul. They'd been following after Apollos, and he's saying, don't do that.
Yeah.
Don't follow after men.
Right.
Yeah. He says, you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. Kind of the family tree there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And that's even though it even mentions, where was that? Well, in mentioning that, and you are Christ and Christ is God's, it points to the idea that Christ doesn't act on his own personal
will.
It's the will of the Father, which has been established from the beginning.
Yep, absolutely. John, we better stop.
All right. Well, thanks for joining in. We'll see you next time.